New York is falling. As the zombie apocalypse erupts, Mara needs a miracle. Her father, however, has something better, a contact. He knows the one person who can extract her from the city. Chapter 1. Whispers of Outbreak. The city of New York City was not merely alive, it was thrumming with a frantic electric pulse. Taxi horns blared in jagged, uneven rhythms, a cacophony of frustrated movement. The faint, sickly sweet buzz of flickering neon signs, a smear of electric blues and bruised reds, reflected off the grimy, rain-slicked asphalt of the street. Beneath it all was the constant, relentless murmur of millions of people, a low, collective hum that made them feel less like individuals and more like interchangeable parts of the city's colossal machine. Mara Whitmore trudged down 34th Street, her backpack, heavy with medical textbooks, cutting into the muscle of one shoulder. Her earbuds were in, but the brash symphony of the city was a beast that refused to be silenced. She clutched her textbooks tight in one hand and a coffee she could hardly afford in the other, its fragrant steam a temporary comfort. A streaking yellow cab swerved violently past a double-parked delivery truck, the side mirror missing her by what felt like a breathless inch. She muttered a sharp curse under her breath, straightening her glasses. City life, she sighed. Never a goddamn dull moment. Her phone vibrated, a quick, urgent pulse in her pocket. Shifting the books and the still-warm coffee to one slick hand, she fished it out. A faint, genuine smile touched her lips as her father's name, Marcus, flashed across the screen. Just last night, he'd sent a text, a stern, all-caps reminder to eat something other than ramen. She answered with a soft sigh, already rolling her eyes at the thought of his predictable fussing. "Hey, Dad," she said, managing to take a deep, satisfying sip of the perfectly bitter coffee. "Mara, you're still alive. That's good." Her father's voice came through the phone, deep, gravelly, and laced with an unmistakable protective warmth. She leaned against a scarred lamppost. "You eating properly? Don't tell me you skipped breakfast again, young lady." "I had a granola bar," she admitted, wincing internally at the weakness of her own defense. "That's not breakfast. That's a snack pretending to be breakfast. You know what real breakfast is, Mara?" His voice softened as he continued, a wistful note in his tone. "I wish I could be there with you, you know. Keep an eye on you in that concrete maze." She smiled, despite the tension in her neck. Her father had always been her granite shield. A retired military man, chiseled and hardened by years in the field, yet he possessed a tender, careful softness reserved only for her. "I'm fine, Dad. Really. I can handle myself. And besides, remember how much you hate the city. What is it you call it? A cesspool of pollution and twitchy humans." "Yes. And you could have gone to any college closer to home," he countered easily. He chuckled softly, a rich, resonant sound that felt like a momentary burst of sunlight spilling into her otherwise busy, stress-gray day. "Promise me you'll stay inside today. Just try to keep your head down. And call me if something feels off. Anything." "I promise," she said, but this time, the words felt like a lie. A creeping, icy unease had begun to settle, tightening her chest as she glanced at the dense, hurrying crowds. Something in the atmosphere felt wrong. Heavy, expectant, like the air just before a sudden storm. Her father had been a prepper for longer than she could remember, running her through scenarios from power grid collapse to bioterrorism. Her bug-out bag was packed and ready, a required essential. But today, the weight of his warning felt more potent, more real than any drill. Her silence made her father's laugh come through the line, a deliberate, calming sound. "That's my girl. Always trying to sound braver than she is. I'll call you tonight. Don't do anything stupid, and engage those brain cells, Mara." "Love you, Dad," she said, the words a lifeline. "Love you too, Mara, always." The call ended, leaving her with the lingering warmth of her father's voice, and a sudden, sharp, inexplicable shiver that traveled like a chill down her spine. She forcibly shrugged it off, adjusting her backpack strap, and continued her trek toward the looming, impersonal architecture of the medical school building. She was utterly unaware that the city's frantic pulse was about to flatline and transform. Inside the stuffy, fluorescent-lit lecture hall, Mara slipped into her seat just as Professor Landon began to drone on about the complex epidemiology of viral infections. The rhythmic cadence of his voice was hypnotic. She doodled an intricate, mechanical design absent-mindedly in her notebook, the medical terminology swimming together as her thoughts strayed to the city outside. Then, her phone flashed. News alerts, stark white text on a black background. Local hospital reports violent incidents, multiple staff injured. She frowned, the pencil pausing over the page, and opened the article. The report was disjointed, almost unbelievable. A man had collapsed suddenly in a busy supermarket aisle. Surveillance footage, now grainy and viral, allegedly showed him writhing in violent spasms, then suddenly snapping forward to bite a shocked bystander before being violently restrained. Mara's stomach clenched into a tight knot. She clicked on the next link. Another report. Authorities unsure of cause of sudden aggressive outbreaks. Stay vigilant. Her phone buzzed again, a frantic sequence of taps. It was a message from her best friend, Lila. Did you see this? Some guy in Brooklyn went completely rabid. Police had to shoot him. WTF is happening? Mara typed back quickly, her fingers slightly slick on the screen. Yeah. I saw. Don't panic, she wrote, feeling hypocritical. Just stay put. Lock doors if you have to. I'll come back once this class is done. She added a slightly crooked smiley face to soften the raw edge of her words, though the cold spike of unease creeping through her chest wasn't so easily masked. By the time class ended, the city's pulse had accelerated into a dangerous tachycardia. Sirens, not the usual single-car calls, but a wailing continuous chorus, screamed through the streets, tearing through the steady hum of traffic. People moved faster now, not with purpose, but with a skittish desperation, glancing nervously over their shoulders, whispering anxious theories into their phones. Mara walked to the window of her apartment building, her breath catching. A churning, panicked crowd was gathering outside a nearby corner grocery. People were shouting, some running in sudden, aimless bursts, and a man was being violently dragged back by a security guard, his arms flailing like broken wings, his mouth open, teeth visibly bared like some startled primal beast. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking slightly, and dialed her father's number. Dad, she managed, her voice thin and shaky. Something's happening here. People, they're attacking each other. Her eyes were wide with shock, and she spoke rapidly, breathlessly, into the phone. Mara, stop. Stay calm, he interrupted, his voice calm, deep, and instantly commanding. Where are you right now? I'm like 3 minutes away from my building, she whispered, her gaze locked on the frantic scene outside. Okay, now, you walk straight to your apartment building, then lock every door and window. Stay away from crowds. Do not engage. Right now, I need you to only engage your brain cells. Can you do that? Yes, I can do that. But Dad, he cut her off again, the sharpness in his tone softening with an intense affection. I know, you want to help, and you don't know what's going on, but one thing you do know, darling, is how to act in a crisis. We've done this a number of times. Now start heading to your building. Don't touch anyone, and watch out for those speeding cars. You get yourself safe first. Everything else comes after. The sheer weight of his authority made her instantly calmer, more aware of the danger around her. She noticed for the first time how some people rushing past looked ashen, their skin pale and damp in the cold air. Okay, Dad, I'll call you when I get there, she whispered, nodding to herself more than to him. Good. Don't leave your place. I'm going to find a way to get you out of New York, you hear me? Yes, she answered, picking up her pace, her heart now pounding a drumbeat of fear and adrenaline. I love you, always, no matter what. Tears pricked and burned in her eyes, but she blinked them back with furious determination. I love you too. The line went dead, replaced by the rising clamor of the city. Mara quickly took the stairs, her feet pounding a rhythm up to the second floor. She found her roommates, Lila and her ex-boyfriend Jonah, huddled around the television. Babe, it's utterly nuts out there, Lila gasped, pointing a trembling finger at the screen where footage of a panicked police cordon flashed. I think this is only the beginning. What's the news saying? Mara headed straight to the kitchen, pulling open the pantry drawers. She felt a surge of cold relief that her prepper upbringing had her instinctively stock at least 3 solid months of canned goods and dried supplies. They say it's some sort of aggressive flu strain, Jonah answered, his voice rough. No, they're lying. A flu doesn't make people turn into foaming maniacs. Lila shook her head, her usually bright blue eyes wide with terror. The screech of tires outside was deafening, followed instantly by a sickening crunch and the shattering sound of glass. All three rushed to the window. Mara quickly texted her father that she had arrived safe. They huddled together, shoulders touching, watching as the full chaos of the city unfolded outside. The streets were no longer orderly. The crowd was no longer a hum of daily life. People ran past, their screams thin and high-pitched with terror. Another fast-moving car, a black sedan, came from nowhere and slammed into a man who was stumbling slowly in the street. They all gasped when they saw how the impact smacked his body against the concrete, twisting it at a grotesque, impossible angle. A shard of bone in his leg jutted violently through the torn fabric of his pants. Moments later he convulsed once, like a puppet with cut strings, and then, impossibly, got up, lurching and stumbling toward the horrified onlookers. He grabbed one teenage girl by the arm and quickly sank his teeth into her flesh, a tearing sound that made Mara gag. In an unbelievable, sickening fashion, the scene became even more chaotic as several men rushed the attacker, attempting to wrestle him down, and were instantly savagely bitten as well. The bitten men and the teenage girl quickly also began to convulse and lurch, their movements becoming jerky and unnatural, and then they, too, started attacking other people on the streets. Mara swallowed hard, a lump of pure dread caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what her medical student eyes were witnessing. Time passed quickly, in a shivering haze. There was pandemonium outside as she tried to call her dad again, but the call failed to go through, instantly meeting with a static tone. After what felt like agony-filled hours of the three of them just staring outside the window, the streets fell into a kind of eerie, dangerous lull. There were still figures moving, but the sounds of shouting and high-pitched screaming had been replaced with low, guttural growls, faint but unmistakable, drifting up through the cracks of the apartment building. What is happening?" Lila whispered, her voice thin and tight, barely a thread of sound. "I don't know," Mara said, her own voice remarkably steadier than she felt. "But we're going to be okay. We'll stay inside. The government is going to get control of this. Even if they don't, my dad said he's not going to let anything happen to me." She stood, trying to dodge around the terrifying, undeniable truth. Zombies. They all saw it. The biting, the scratching, people turning rabid, stumbling aimlessly through the streets. Their eyes were dull and gray, void of human recognition. Jonah's hand brushed hers as he passed a stack of heavy wooden chairs to reinforce the front door. "We'll survive this. Together." Mara nodded, the corners of her mouth twitching upward in a small, tight, forced smile. She couldn't help but feel a sharp pang of guilt for her father. He was out there somewhere, likely already seeing the chaos unfold in other states. But she pushed the thought aside. For now, she had to focus on the immediate, desperate act of surviving. Night fell over New York, but it brought no relief, only a deeper, inkier terror. Mara sat with Lila and Jonah, their small apartment now a makeshift fortress, barricaded with precariously stacked chairs, shelves, and anything else that could block the entrances. The occasional, isolated scream from the streets below punctuated the constant, underlying hum of panic in the air. "I can't believe this," Lila muttered, pressing her face into her knees. No real information or help was coming from the news reports, which were running tired, contradictory clips. Online, people were calling the infected zombies, while the media carefully dodged the obvious fact everyone could see, calling for calm and advising people to stay indoors. "It's like something out of a cheap horror movie. Except it's real," Mara said softly. Her medical training kicked in, overriding the primal fear. She assessed the situation logically, ignoring the cold prickling at her spine. "We need to think ahead. Water, food, medicine. If this continues, we can't just wait for it to end. We need a plan of action." Jonah frowned, looking out the window at the shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of the distant fires. "You think it's contagious? Like, truly viral?" he asked, voicing the obvious, terrifying question. Mara paused. She had studied viruses, outbreaks, contagions, but nothing could have prepared her for this sudden, visceral hell. Still, she answered with the certainty of her training. "From what I've seen, definitely. The initial infection, what they called the flu, may have taken longer, days or a week, but a direct bite or scratch seems to be almost instantaneously rabid. Whatever it is, it's spreading terrifyingly fast. We can't take chances." Hours passed in slow-motion agony. Mara checked her phone constantly, reading updates that were more terrifying by the minute. Schools closed, transportation shut down, reports of violent outbreaks escalating into mass casualties. By midnight, the city had transformed into a true place of terror, the skyline blinking with frantic emergency lights and angry orange fires burning in distant neighborhoods. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window, imagining her father in the mountains, safe but likely consumed with worry for her. A sharp pang of longing tightened her chest. She wished she could hear his voice again, wished he was there to tell her everything would be okay. Her phone buzzed again, this time a single, sharp vibration. A text from an unknown number. "This is Lieutenant Luke Shrouds. Your father asked me to get you. Prepare to leave." Mara's pulse spiked, leaping in her throat. She didn't recognize the number, but her father's last message had promised he would arrange for someone to get her. She showed the message to Lila and Jonah, her hands trembling. "Dad has found someone to help get us somewhere safe," she told her friends. A small, fragile bubble of relief finally expanding in her chest for the first time since this whole nightmare began. "Do you really think we should go? We have enough food to hold us out until this whole thing calms the hell down." Jonah said, doubtful. The scene on the streets was now something out of a low-budget, gore-splattered horror movie. I think so, Mara said, though a tremor of uncertainty still laced her words. Her father had always been organized, always prepared. He'd spent the last 10 years of her life preparing for a disaster exactly like this. And this was a disaster. The news had stopped broadcasting live, just running a sterile loop of earlier footage. There had been no word from the government, which was a huge, deafening tell. If her father reached out to a military contact to take her out of New York, then she had no choice but to trust whoever was on the other end. Then we go, Jonah said firmly, his eyes resolute. We stick together. We leave safely, or not at all. What time did he say he's coming? Mara tried to fire off a message to him. Calling was useless, as no calls had been going through for hours. She frowned when the message refused to send. The singular, tenuous network bar that had been holding out for hours finally disappearing, leaving a void of connectivity. Shit, she said, the word heavy with finality. What? Lila asked, her blue eyes wide, reflecting the faint streetlights. We are officially offline, Mara muttered. What do we do? Jonah asked, his voice low. We wait. I'm sure my dad gave him my location, she said, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel, wishing for all the world she was in the safety of the mountain cabin with her dad. Outside, the city screamed its death throes. Shadows moved like living, lurching nightmares. Fires cast flickering, demonic light on walls and streets. And somewhere in the distance, a raw, hopeless scream pierced the night, a sound that made Mara's stomach twist with both fear and a fierce rising determination. She took a deep, shaky breath, feeling the full, terrifying weight of the world pressing down on her young shoulders. And then, she steeled herself. She was Mara Whitmore, daughter of a soldier, med student, survivor. And she would make it through this. Chapter 2. The Shifting Barricade and Unexpected Cargo. The first sounds of the morning were not the usual screech of subway brakes or the aggressive thrum of a garbage truck, but a low, ceaseless moan that drifted up from the streets below. It was the sound of a city in pain, its humanity stripped away and replaced by a primal, hungry drone. Mara woke abruptly, her neck stiff from sleeping upright against the kitchen counter, the smell of stale coffee and fear heavy in the air. She pushed herself up, her limbs heavy with exhaustion, and moved quietly to the living room window, pulling back the edge of the blanket they had tacked over the glass. The light of the new day was thin and sickly, filtering through the perpetual haze of New York smog, now compounded by plumes of distant smoke. The streets, once a vibrant river of vehicles and pedestrians, were a graveyard of abandoned cars. A black sedan, angled awkwardly into a streetlight, a yellow cab listing against a fire hydrant, its hazards blinking uselessly. The pavement was stained with dark, drying patches that Mara's medical brain instantly categorized as blood. And the figures, the infected, were still there, lurching and shuffling in aimless patterns. They moved with a dreadful certainty, their only purpose, the propagation of their own suffering. Lila was curled up on the sofa, her face buried in a throw pillow, making small, wounded noises. Jonah sat opposite, gripping a metal fire poker, his eyes wide and vacant. The barricade they had erected, a haphazard fortress of furniture, looked flimsy and ridiculous in the cold light of day. We need to ration the water, Mara whispered, her voice rough. And clear out the kitchen. We can't keep the supplies here. It's too exposed. Jonah nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the window. I keep thinking, this has to be a joke, right? A mass hallucination. Mara let the desperate humor pass. It's real, Jonah. We need to function in the reality we have, not the one we wish we had. She went to the cabinets and began pulling down cans of soup and dried rice, lining them up by the stove. Organization was the only thing standing between them and total panic. A sharp, metallic rapping echoed from the hallway, vibrating through the thin apartment door. It wasn't the slow, clumsy push of the infected. It was deliberate and urgent. Mara froze, every muscle tightening. Jonah scrambled up, raising the poker. Lila choked on a stifled cry. Rattle. Rattle. Pause. Rattle. 3 quick knocks, then a short gap, then another sharp one. It was a pattern. A code. Who is it? Mara called out, her voice tight, pressed against the sturdy wood of the door. Mara, it's Mike. Open up. We know you're in there. The voice was strained, recognizable as Mike, one of Jonah's closest friends and a fellow engineering student. Jonah's shoulders slumped in immediate relief. It's Mike and the others. They must have made it. He started moving toward the barricade. Wait, Mara commanded, holding out a hand. How many of you? And how did you know to come here? A woman's voice, equally strained, called out. It's Sam, Leah, and Mike. 3 of us. Jonah told us months ago that if anything went sideways, you were the only one who actually had a plan. "We saw your backpack, Mara. Please, we're clean. But we barely made it through the night." Mara looked at Jonah. His eyes were pleading. Mike and Leah were part of their small social circle, and Sam, Mike's girlfriend, was shy but kind. They weren't strangers. But adding 3 new people meant 3 new risks, 3 new mouths to feed, and the potential for noise. Yet to leave them to the growing horrors outside was unconscionable. "Okay, stand back from the door," Mara instructed, addressing the hall. "I'm going to unstack the furniture, but don't rush in. One at a time. And tell me if you heard or saw anything on your way up the stairs." "It's mostly clear on the 2nd floor," Mike called back, sounding winded. "1 or 2 of them shuffling, but they're downstairs, drawn to the main street noise." Mara, with Jonah helping, carefully and silently began to dismantle the barricade. Each chair scrape on the floor sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. When the front door was finally visible, Mara peered through the wide-angle peephole. Mike, tall and gaunt, was pressed against the wall, clutching a heavy plastic baseball bat. Leah, petite and usually vibrant, looked gray with terror, her hands pressed over her mouth. Sam stood behind them, her face slick with tears, clutching a small, useless backpack. They looked exhausted, not infected. Mara took a deep breath, released the deadbolt with a loud metallic clack, and swung the door inward just enough to slip them through. "Get in, now!" The 3 friends tumbled inside in a frantic rush, the sound of their heavy breathing filling the tiny hall. Mara immediately kicked the door shut and, with Jonah's help, began shoving the chairs and shelves back into place, creating a second, stronger wall of wood and cloth. "Oh God, thank you," Leah whispered, sinking to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. "Mara, you are a lifesaver. We were in my dorm, and the noise started. It was bad. We came straight here," Mike stammered, his eyes darting nervously toward the window. Mara walked back to the living room, her face set. "Listen up, this isn't a party, and this isn't safe. We have food for maybe a month if we ration hard, and enough water for a week if we are conservative. You are here because of Jonah, and because I'm not leaving people I know outside. But my rules are absolute: silence, rationing, and no unauthorized movement." She pointed to their meager bags. "Show me what you brought. Anything that makes noise, anything perishable, or anything useless gets dealt with now." Mike produced the bat and a half-empty 6-pack of lukewarm water bottles. Leah had a purse with a phone, a charger, and a few granola bars. Sam had mostly clothes. It was amateur hour, but she suppressed the sigh. They had made it alive, which was the only currency that mattered now. The rest of the morning was spent consolidating their resources. Mara instructed the expanded group of 6 on how to move silently, how to use the bathroom, minimal flushing, and how to communicate, only hand gestures unless absolutely necessary. She organized a central cache of food and appointed Jonah as the inventory keeper, giving him a task that would keep his mind focused. Lila, still struggling with shock, was given the simple but vital job of refilling their drinking containers from the faucet and marking the count. The 3 newcomers were set to work silently tearing strips of fabric from old towels to use for makeshift bandages, a task that demanded focus but little movement. Mara herself sat by the window, watching the street. The quiet was more unsettling than the screaming. It was a predatory silence, broken only by the occasional clatter of something falling, or a distant heart-stopping shriek that cut the air like glass. The absence of any military, police, or government response was the loudest alarm bell of all. Her father's warnings, once dismissed as survivalist paranoia, now felt like the only solid ground in a world that had dissolved overnight. She checked her phone repeatedly, still no signal, a small, frustrating square with a crossed-out line in the corner. The last message from the unknown Lieutenant Shrouds was their only hope, and it felt distant, impossible. Around 2 in the afternoon, the sky, which had been a perpetual sickly gray, began to take on a heavier, bruised color. A low, steady rain started to fall, washing the grime and blood into the sewers. But it failed to wash away the stench of decay and fear that clung to the air. Lila was whispering to Sam in a corner when Mara held up a silencing hand, her head cocked toward the building's main entrance. She heard it first, a sound distinct from the general urban decay. It was the deep, rhythmic growl of heavy machinery, not a passenger vehicle, but something armored and purposeful. It was getting closer, moving slowly, but with unstoppable force. Jonah's eyes went wide. "Is that?" "Quiet," Mara ordered, moving swiftly to the window, her heart rate accelerating, not with panic, but with a sharp, focused expectation. A moment later, a vehicle appeared on the street below. It was an olive-drab Humvee, heavily modified, not standard military issue but something rugged and private. It moved with deliberate care, its thick tires crushing the abandoned debris without slowing. The vehicle was bristling with non-lethal deterrents and had dark, tinted windows. It pulled directly up to the curb near Mara's building, shutting off its engine. The sudden silence, after the low rumble of the diesel, was profound. The rear door of the Humvee opened, and 3 figures emerged, each clad in dark, reinforced tactical gear, pants, combat boots, and jackets that looked impervious to tearing. They wore no masks, but their faces were grim and focused. 2 were burly, serious men, moving with the practiced economy of soldiers. The third was a woman, smaller, who immediately took up a defensive position, weapon ready, scanning the rooftops. Then, the driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, his build powerful but lean, and he moved with a fluid, disciplined grace. He wore a simple, dark green field jacket over a rugged shirt, his clothing less overtly military than his team, but the way he moved spoke of training. His dark hair was cut short, his jaw square. He looked older than Mara, perhaps in his early 30s, his eyes holding a calm, assessing sharpness that instantly drew her attention. He was the physical embodiment of competence and control, a striking figure against the backdrop of urban collapse. For a split second, Mara's medical student brain, trained to analyze anatomy, registered the powerful, compact lines of his frame, the severe focus of his face, and a sudden, unwelcome rush of purely feminine attraction momentarily eclipsed the fear. Too focused, too hardened, too handsome for this nightmare. A voice whispered in the back of her mind, quickly silenced by the urgency of the moment. He pulled a small satellite phone from his pocket, keyed a button, and held it to his ear. Seconds later, Mara's own phone, dead for hours, suddenly buzzed violently in her hand. A single, solid network bar had appeared, a miracle of desperate technology. A text flashed on the screen. "We are outside your location. Ground floor. Get ready." She looked down at the text, then up at the man below, who was now scanning the building's facade, clearly looking for a signal from the second-floor windows. Mara opened the window just a crack, letting in a gust of damp, cool air and the faint, pervasive stench of the city. "Lieutenant Shrouds?" she called out, keeping her voice low but firm, cutting across the unsettling quiet. The man immediately found her window, his gaze locking onto hers with a precision that was unnerving. His expression didn't change. No surprise, no relief, just a shift to immediate, focused engagement. "Mara Whitmore?" he responded, his voice strong and clear, carrying easily to the second floor. "Yes. I'm Luke Shrouds. We have a limited window of opportunity. Your father sent us. Are you alone?" "No. There are 6 of us. Myself, Lila, Jonah, and 3 others, all clean," Mara stated, her mind racing through the tactical implications. She saw the lieutenant's jaw clench, a muscle ticking briefly under his skin at the increased number. The immediate disappointment and frustration in his eyes were unmistakable. Mara knew in that instant she had just complicated his mission and increased the risk for his entire unit. "Understood. That changes the extraction protocol," Luke stated, his tone tightening, the smooth professional delivery now edged with sharp annoyance. He spoke into his radio first, giving terse, low orders to his team. The woman soldier moved to cover the alley entrance, while the other 2 positioned themselves near the building's front door. "We don't have time for a full sweep of the lower floors or any further discussion. I need you to move quickly. Are there any visible infected in the stairwell or the immediate second-floor landing?" "The stairwell should be clear. The building entrance is barricaded from the inside, and they seem to be concentrated on the street level, drawn to the main traffic noise." "Good. Listen carefully," Luke instructed. "We are going to enter the building now. When you hear us breaching your barricade, I need you and the 5 others to be ready to move immediately. No baggage, no stops, just what you can carry in one hand. Move to the window if you hear sustained noise, or a breach on the other side of the building. Do you understand?" "Yes, Lieutenant. Minimal gear, ready to move on breach," Mara confirmed, her voice steady and low. The moment of attraction was instantly forgotten, replaced by the need to prove her competence and minimize the fallout from her impromptu rescue mission. Luke Shrouds gave a sharp, professional nod, his eyes briefly flicking down to assess the width of the window opening. There was no attempt at warmth, no comforting sentiment, just a transaction of survival. He turned and signaled his unit. Mara pulled the window shut, the sound almost lost in the sudden, concentrated thump-thump-thump, as the soldiers began methodically breaching the front door barricade on the ground floor. "Lila, Jonah, Mike, Sam, Leah, stand by the door. Lightest items only. No noise. Now." Mara grabbed her prepper bag, heavy, dense, and essential, and slung it over her shoulder. She looked at the terrified faces of her friends, her expression hard. "We follow the man's orders. No questions. No hysterics. We move fast. Our lives depend on it." The noise from below intensified, the heavy crack of wood, the scraping of metal, and then the sharp, percussive burst of a single controlled gunshot, clearly meant as a deterrent or a distraction. not a kill shot. "He's through the lobby," Jonah whispered, clutching the fire poker, his knuckles white. "Get ready," Mara hissed, pulling back the last of the furniture she had used to reinforce their own inner barricade. The sounds of heavy, fast-moving boots were now echoing up the stairwell. A moment later, the footsteps stopped right outside their door. There was a pause, a moment of absolute heart-pounding silence, and then 3 hard, rapid knocks, the same code Mike had used. Mara unlocked the door and threw it open. Luke Shrouds stood in the doorway, his weapon lowered but ready, flanked by the 2 large soldiers, their faces impassive behind the glare of their protective glasses. Luke's uniform jacket was damp from the rain, and his boots were scuffed with street dirt. He glanced quickly, analytically, over the 6 terrified civilians, his gaze lingering momentarily on Mara's robust, military-grade backpack. A brief, almost imperceptible nod of professional acknowledgement for her preparation. 6, he stated into his radio, the single word clipped, confirming the unexpected head count and signaling his team to adjust. He then addressed Mara directly, his tone crisp and unwavering. "My team will form a moving shield. We are moving downstairs now. Follow the woman soldier, Mina. She will be point. Your group stays tight, close enough to touch. No gaps. Mara, you are the last in line. Your job is to ensure no one breaks formation, and to signal me immediately if you see any hazard in the rear." He was 32, she was 22, but in that moment, he was the commander, and she was the most capable follower. There was a natural authority in his stance, an immediate command presence that demanded and earned respect. Mara didn't hesitate. "Understood, Lieutenant. 6 will hold formation, Mara taking the rear guard," she confirmed, her voice steady and low. "Good. Mina," Luke signaled the woman soldier, who was now in the hallway, her rifle pointed down the stairs. "Let's move, quick and quiet." The descent was a terrifying blur of concentrated motion. Mina led, moving with the lithe stealth of a predator, checking corners with her weapon before signaling clear. The 6 civilians moved as one, a terrified, clumsy centipede clinging to each other. Mara, last in line, found her eyes darting back and forth, checking the second-floor landings and the closed apartment doors, her ears straining for the telltale scraping or growling that would signal a threat. When they reached the lobby, the remnants of Mara's earlier barricade lay smashed and scattered, a testament to the soldiers' focused force. The 4th soldier, a heavy-set man, was holding the outer door slightly ajar, scanning the street. Luke Shrouds moved swiftly to the entrance, his eyes assessing the rainy street. The slow-moving, shuffling figures clustered near the wrecked Humvee, drawn by the engine noise, but kept at bay by the other 2 soldiers. "Street clear for the window." Mina, covering fire to the right, Mara's group, moved to the vehicle. Now, the dash from the front door to the Humvee was the longest 3 seconds of Mara's life. The sight of the infected was up close now. Their gray, slack faces, their red-rimmed eyes, their mouths open in soundless, gaping hunger. One of them, a woman in a soaked business suit, turned its head with a sickening crunch and began to shamble toward them. Mina raised her weapon and fired 3 sharp, non-lethal concussive rounds that thwacked against the asphalt near the infected, sending it reeling in confusion, allowing the 6 civilians to pile awkwardly into the back of the Humvee. Mara got in last, turning to see Luke Shrouds take a final, comprehensive look at the street. He signaled his team, and they swiftly jumped into the seats, slamming the doors shut just as the engine roared to life. The lieutenant climbed into the passenger seat beside the driver, turning once to meet Mara's gaze through the dim light of the vehicle's cabin. "Your father sends his assurance of safety," he said, his voice now slightly softer, though still devoid of superfluous emotion. "You have cost us valuable time, Mara. Don't waste it. We are taking you to a secure extraction point. We move now." He turned forward, and the Humvee surged away from the curb, its weight and speed a sudden brutal force against the chaos of the city. As they sped away, Mara watched the silhouettes of the lurching infected disappear into the rain-swept streets. She had made it. She had 6 lives depending on her. She had a soldier who was all business, all capability, and clearly annoyed. The journey out of the city was just beginning, and Mara Whitmore knew, with a cold certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was no longer a student. She was a moving target heading into the unknown. Chapter 3. The Gauntlet and the Grave. The Humvee roared to life, a deep, powerful counterpoint to the city's surrounding decay. Inside the cramped cabin, the air was thick with unfiltered terror from the 5 civilians crammed into the rear bench, mixed with the cold steel and ozone scent of Luke's tactical gear. Mara sat pressed against the side wall, her heavy prepper bag, her lifeline, wedged between her feet. The 6 civilians were a single, trembling, fleshy mass of unplanned cargo. Luke Shrouds did not spare them a glance. He barked terse commands to the driver, a silent, powerful man Mara only knew as Rook, and to the three soldiers, Mina, Sarge, and Fixer, who were already checking the functionality of the vehicle's external systems via internal monitors. His attention was absolute, his focus the road ahead, or rather, the chaotic battlefield that was once the island of Manhattan. "Rook, stay on avenues where possible," Luke commanded over the engine's drone. "We need speed, minimal gridlock. Mina, prepare the concussion dispersers. Sarge, Fixer, keep those lanes clear. Mara, front window observation is now your duty. Note any signs of organized resistance, military, police, or fires that indicate structural compromise." His inclusion of her in the command structure was not a gesture of trust, but of expediency. He was using her brain, not validating her presence. Mara accepted the role instantly, ignoring the grudging resentment she felt for his earlier annoyance. Survival was pragmatic. The initial phase of the escape was a brutal, jarring ride. The Humvee, reinforced and heavy, became a battering ram against the gridlock. They didn't drive, they plowed. Cars were shoved aside, crumpled wrecks of civilian life tossed carelessly onto the sidewalks. The sound of ripping metal and shattering glass was a relentless, high-decibel soundtrack to the end of the world. The infected were everywhere. They were not fast, but they were innumerable, emerging from side streets, pouring out of subway entrances, drawn by the tremendous noise and vibration of the vehicle. Mara pressed her face close to the tinted, ballistic glass, her breath misting the surface. Up close, the infected were horrifying in their specificity. They weren't uniform movie monsters. They were recent human beings, a postal worker, a businessman in a bespoke suit, a street musician with a smashed guitar still strapped to his back. Their movements were jerky, almost spastic, driven by a hyper-aggressive instinct that defied normal musculoskeletal limits. They ran into the vehicle's path, their bodies hitting the thick windshield with sickening, wet thuds. "Contact! 11 o'clock. Massive pileup at 42nd. Mara yelled, pointing, her voice hoarse but cutting through the noise. Luke adjusted his route plan on a small tactical screen. "Rook, we're going through. Mina, prepare a lateral discharge. Keep them clear of the tires." As they approached the intersection, the infected were an undulating, dark wave, too thick to simply push through. Mina, leaning forward in her seat, activated a switch. A low-frequency thrumming sound began, escalating quickly into a high-pitched, painful shriek. The concussive dispersers. The sound didn't kill, but it momentarily stunned, causing the nearest infected to clutch their heads, stumbling and turning away from the source of the unbearable noise. Rook hit the accelerator. The Humvee surged through the narrow gap, passing a bus that was completely covered in a carpet of shamblers, their collective weight having collapsed the chassis. The civilians in the back, Lila, Sam, Mike, Leah, and Jonah, were silent, strapped in but vibrating with suppressed screaming. "They're faster than the report suggested," Mara noted. "Not an observation, but a clinical data point. The ones that were bitten most recently, the ones in sports gear, they show significant velocity." Luke nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his chin. "A viral mutation. The incubation period is accelerating." Noted, "Keep eyes on the second and third floors. They sometimes drop." The escape became a tactical ballet of destruction. At one point, a larger, more aggressive infected, a man whose face was a mask of dark, dried blood, managed to seize the external handle near Mina's door, its teeth gnashing against the glass. Without a word, Sarge triggered a small external electrical current. The infected's grip dissolved, its body dropping instantly, smoking slightly, leaving a grimy, charred smear on the metal. The smell was another constant aggressor. Decay, iron, gasoline, and the metallic tang of fear. It all funneled through the vehicle's vents, even with the air filtration running hard. Mara found herself focusing on Luke's profile, the precise set of his jaw, the cool, detached efficiency of his hands on the console, as an anchor against the sensory overload of the apocalypse just inches away. He was not a man. He was a machine of strategy, and the faint, initial pull of attraction twisted into a desperate admiration for his cold, pure competence. They hit the Lincoln Tunnel entrance only to find it sealed, not by the military, but by a tangle of overturned tractor trailers and the flickering glow of a massive fire. Luke diverted instantly. Plan B, George Washington Bridge. "It's too exposed, but we don't have another option this far north," Luke announced. The drive north was marginally clearer but more exposed. They saw other vehicles, sometimes packed with desperate families, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the hordes. Luke gave no thought to stopping. Assistance would mean death for his entire unit. It wasn't until they hit the high steel arches of the George Washington Bridge that they felt a momentary respite. The bridge deck was relatively clear, windswept and slick with rain, with the open water below acting as a natural deterrent. It was a line of demarcation. As the Humvee roared across the Hudson River and they left the tight, claustrophobic canyons of Manhattan behind, The tension inside the cabin eased slightly, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. They were out. The first, impossible obstacle was cleared. The empty handover. The journey continued west for hours, a monotonous blur of empty highways and desolate small towns that seemed to have been evacuated days earlier. Luke drove the last leg, replacing Rook, the smooth transition highlighting the unit's seamless professionalism. Their destination was a secure rendezvous point just outside Scranton, Pennsylvania, a warehouse complex owned by a close associate of Mara's father, a fellow prepper named Elias. The plan, Mara knew, was to hand her over to Elias's small, heavily armed group, who would then take her the rest of the way to the mountain hideout, allowing Luke's unit to return to whatever clandestine mission her father had tasked them with. They arrived in the late evening, the setting sun painting the overcast sky in bruised purples and angry reds. The warehouse complex was remote, surrounded by a high, chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, exactly as Mara's father had described. But the gate was smashed inward, not cut or opened, and the large parking area was empty, save for 3 abandoned specialized utility vehicles, all recognizable as Elias's fleet. Luke brought the Humvee to a silent tactical stop 50 yards from the main entrance. He killed the engine, and the ensuing silence was heavy, broken only by the hissing static of the rain hitting the metal roof. Perimeter check. Mina and Sarge approached the main structure. Fixer, cover the rear. Rook, perimeter integrity, Luke ordered, his voice low and devoid of the easy confidence from the high-speed escape. This silence was different. It was stagnant, wrong. Mara watched the 3 soldiers move, their steps measured, their weapons scanning. Mina, silent and swift, signaled back, holding up 3 fingers, then crossing them out. 3 down. Luke opened his door. Stay here. Everyone, don't move, don't talk, don't drop anything. Mara, you're with me. Mara nodded immediately. Understood, Lieutenant. She grabbed the crowbar from the door panel, her father's training resurfacing. Never go in empty-handed. Leave the tool, Luke commanded sharply, glancing at the weapon in her hand. I need clear hands for communication, not clumsy interference. It's a 5-foot perimeter and I know the layout, Mara countered, keeping the crowbar low, and I'm not standing outside in an unsecure zone. Luke paused, assessing the fierce determination in her 22-year-old eyes. She was exhausted, terrified, but radiating cold resolve. He sighed, a barely audible expulsion of breath that spoke volumes of his fatigue and impatience. Fine. Keep up. Stay behind me. They moved into the warehouse lobby. The stench hit them first, not the city's complex chemical decay, but the singular metallic odor of fresh carnage. The reception area was dark, illuminated only by Luke's tactical flashlight. The scene was sparse but devastating. A large wooden table had been splintered, scattered papers fluttering in the slight draft from the broken door. On the floor lay a series of specialized medical packs, their contents spilled. Sterile gauze, antibiotics, and surgical tools mixed with deep red stains and the sickly brown residue of dried filth. They were operating, Mara whispered, pointing to an unopened trauma kit beside a pool of blood that had soaked into the industrial carpeting. A field surgery or triage point. Something happened fast. Luke moved his light beam to the main tragedy. Against the far wall, 3 sets of military-grade custom bug-out packs, the hallmark of high-level preppers, had been slashed open, their contents violently strewn. Rations were scattered, but the most damning evidence was the heavy-duty communication equipment, including a high-powered amateur radio, which lay smashed, the screen cracked, the components bitten through. They're not here, Luke stated, his voice flat. He pointed the beam at a thick, iron door leading deeper into the complex. The door was deeply scored, not by tools, but by furious, repetitive impacts, claw marks and shallow, repeated teeth indentations. They were ambushed, probably by a small, aggressive group. They tried to hold the line here long enough for a retreat, but they were breached. They didn't run without their packs, which means they couldn't reach them. The infected got here first. The horror was not in the presence of bodies, but their absence. Mara realized that the infected must have dragged the victims away, perhaps even consumed them, leaving only the scattered gear and the sickening blood spatter. Elias and his small team were gone. The secondary extraction point was a mass grave site. Mara walked over to the nearest pack, her stomach churning. It was Elias's. She'd recognized the custom stitching. She reached down and picked up a small, dog-eared photograph lying among the spilled water purification tablets. Elias, smiling broadly, standing next to Mara's father at a fishing trip years ago. The picture was slightly sticky with blood. She fought back the wave of nausea, her focus snapping back to Luke. The next designated waypoint? Mara asked, her voice tight, formal. Luke ran a gloved hand over his short hair, his frustration palpable. There is no next waypoint. This was the transfer point. Your father was supposed to be waiting for confirmation before proceeding with the final stage. With Elias's unit neutralized, this location is compromised, and my orders terminate here. I cannot risk my unit traveling further without a confirmed, secure drop-off. Mara looked at the evidence. The ruined packs, the blood, the shattered equipment. Elias was highly trained. If he failed, the threat level was astronomical. The mountain cabin, Mara stated, stepping forward, abandoning the formal address for a blunt insistence. The place in Montana, that's the only truly safe structure your unit can confirm. You have the coordinates, don't you? My dad made sure of that. Luke hesitated, his focus momentarily shifting from the scene of the attack to the immediate tactical nightmare she presented. Diverting his mission to a location over 2,000 miles away was beyond his mandate, a commitment of fuel, time, and risk that was almost suicidal in the current climate. But abandoning the daughter of the man who organized this entire escape, a man he clearly respected, was also not an option. He looked at Mina, who shook her head slightly, her gaze warning him against the madness. Luke ran a calculation in his head. Risk of discovery in Scranton versus the long-shot journey west. The coordinates are for a property owned by Marcus Whitmore, deep in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness. Remote. I have them, Luke confirmed, his voice hard, the sound of a man making an impossible decision. It is not a confirmed safe haven. It's a shot in the dark. It will take 3 days, minimum, of high-risk travel. We are going, but any resource we consume now is subtracted directly from our survival margin. Mara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Understood, Lieutenant. We conserve everything. Luke turned and barked the new orders to his team, the change in destination adding a heavy layer of exhaustion and dread to their posture. The satellite silence. The Humvee was once again speeding down an empty interstate, heading relentlessly west. The civilian group was numb, shocked into silence by the sight of the blood-splattered ruins of the extraction point. Even Jonah, Mara's ex-boyfriend, was leaning against the window, his eyes vacant, the horror finally overwhelming him. Mara, however, felt a cold, clinical clarity. Elias was gone. The only thread connecting her to safety was the man sitting up front, the man who knew her father's coordinates. She watched Luke from behind, noting the way his hand instinctively rested on the controls for the external floodlights and the radio. She needed confirmation that her father was even alive, that he hadn't come to Scranton, found the scene, and been overwhelmed. After an hour of silent driving, she leaned forward, resting her hand lightly on the back of the lieutenant's seat. Lieutenant Shrouds, I need to contact my father. Luke stiffened, but didn't turn around. We've established the communications grid is compromised. The city systems are down, and our initial signal failed. You used a satellite phone to contact me at the apartment, Mara insisted, her voice kept carefully low and even, avoiding the hysteria that would instantly shut him down. You have a clear line out now. You have my father's direct satellite number. I need to know if he received the update about the change in destination. The logic was undeniable. Luke sighed heavily, the sound communicating his deep reluctance to confront this specific piece of the mission's failure. He knew, better than anyone, that if Marcus Whitmore wasn't answering, it wasn't a problem with the network. Mara, your father is likely already in Montana. He would have started heading there as soon as he dispatched us. He knows the risks of external communication, Luke said, a clear attempt to put her off. If he's in Montana, he has reception, Mara countered, her voice rising slightly despite her effort to maintain control. His satellite phone never leaves his side. If he's in the cabin, he's monitoring this channel. I just saw the remains of Elias's comms gear. They were breached. I need confirmation that he is safe. The intensity in her voice finally made him relent. He knew the risk of emotional instability in his cargo was greater than the risk of making one short, low-emission satellite call. Luke pulled the Humvee over to the shoulder of the empty highway, killed the engine, and the cabin was once again plunged into a stressful, heavy silence. The others watched, breathing shallowly. Luke reached into a secure pocket of his jacket and pulled out the small, hardened satellite phone. He keyed in a number from memory, Marcus Whitmore's personal code. Mara watched his hands, her entire existence hinged on the tone that would follow. The phone connected with a series of unnatural, high-pitched chirps, followed by a metallic, echoing ring. It rang once. It rang twice. It rang a third time, the sound painfully loud and intrusive in the closed space of the Humvee. Luke hesitated. He watched the screen, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the display that indicated the phone was attempting to reach the contact. He held the phone to his ear for a long moment, listening to the dead air between the metallic rings. Mara leaned forward, her heart hammering against her ribs, the terrifying silence answering her biggest fear. The phone rang a fourth time. Luke cursed softly, under his breath, a low, rasping sound of frustration that was unlike his usual unflappable professionalism. He let it ring one more time, then, with a sharp, abrupt movement, he disconnected the call, cutting off the ringing mid-tone. He turned to face Mara, his expression completely unreadable, hardened back into the mask of the commander. As I suspected, he stated, his voice now flat, devoid of emotion, the practiced voice of someone delivering an unwanted but necessary command. The grid interference is severe. My satellite uplink is strong, but the receiving terminal is either offline or the signal is being heavily disrupted by solar flare activity, or the sheer volume of grid failures. It happens with these systems. We will try again at the next major checkpoint, but do not rely on it. Your father is a highly trained operative. He is fine, and he knows we are coming. He did not mention the possibility of the attack spreading to Montana. He did not mention that Marcus Whitmore never missed a call, even when hunting. He delivered the lie, the network excuse, with the calm, practiced certainty of a soldier maintaining the morale of his troops. Mara stared at him, trying to find a flicker of doubt, a sign of panic. There was none. She saw only the impersonal focus of the lieutenant, the man who had just risked his life to extract them, the man who carried the entire weight of this impossible journey on his shoulders. But the cold logic of her training screamed that the network was not the issue. The lack of an answer was. Yet what choice did she have? To panic would achieve nothing. To doubt him was to undermine her only means of survival. She forced herself to nod, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Understood, Lieutenant. My apologies for the tactical interruption. Luke simply nodded, a curt acknowledgement of her compliance. He placed the satellite phone back in the secure pocket, shifted the vehicle into drive, and the Humvee surged back onto the empty highway, heading into the unknown darkness of the west. The truth, wrapped in a blanket of professionalism and the silence of a failed call, lay heavy between Mara and the man she desperately needed to trust. The journey to the Montana wilderness had officially begun. The high-stakes drive and the devastating discovery at the extraction point. Chapter 4. The Unburdening of Ghosts. The westward journey was a brutal, relentless exercise in scarcity and vigilance. The Humvee, their metallic cocoon against the collapse, had become stale and claustrophobic. They drove in long, exhausting shifts, stopping only when absolutely necessary to refuel, scavenge for water, or rest their eyes from the incessant scanning of the ravaged landscape. Luke Shrouds ran the operation with the cold efficiency of a surgeon in a slaughterhouse. Every stop was a calculated risk, timed for the minimal light of dawn or the deepest hours of night. He implemented a draconian rationing system, water limited to 1 canteen per person per day, MREs, meals ready to eat, split between 2 people, their calorie count barely enough to sustain basic function. The civilians, already weakened by days of fear, found the discipline crushing, but they were too terrified of the alternative to protest effectively. Mara, however, thrived on the structure. She worked almost side by side with Luke, though always separated by the thick glass partition and the formality of his command. She helped Mina track the remaining fuel and mapped potential danger zones, using her knowledge of geography and her own analytical mind to predict where population density might be highest. She didn't seek his praise, but his stony professional acknowledgement, a terse "good work, Whitmore," was more valuable than a torrent of empty platitudes. One night, somewhere in Ohio, they needed to divert sharply due to a massive, burning bridge. They had to take a secondary road, which led them near a deserted small-town gas station. "Rook, 2 minutes of fuel only," Luke ordered, his voice tight over the comm system. "Mina, fixer, establish a 360-degree perimeter. Sarge, water search in the back storage. Mara, observation." As the soldiers moved with their practiced, lethal grace, the 6 civilians were ordered to stay locked in the vehicle. Mike, Jonah's friend, and the most volatile of the new additions, began to tremble. "We're close," Mike whispered, his voice cracking, leaning forward between the seats. "I grew up 2 towns over. My parents live maybe 10 minutes from here. We just passed the sign for Harmony Falls." His girlfriend, Sam, pressed her face against the window, tears silently tracking through the grime on her cheeks. "Mike, no." Luke said, "We can't stop." "He doesn't understand," Mike hissed, his gaze desperate. "They have a bunker. My dad always had a bunker. If they got the signal, they're there. I just need 10 minutes. I need to know." Jonah put a comforting hand on his shoulder, but Mike shrugged it off violently. The movement was enough to catch Luke's attention. Luke, standing guard outside the driver's side, turned, his face illuminated by the harsh moonlight and the dim glow of his headlamp. He opened the driver's door and leaned in, his imposing figure filling the opening. His eyes, usually assessing the perimeter, were now fixed entirely on Mike. "Silence," Luke commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You are a liability, not a priority." "Get back." "You don't get it, Lieutenant," Mike pleaded, his voice thick with unspent grief and rising rebellion. "My family is 10 minutes away. I can't. I won't leave without checking. Luke stepped fully into the Humvee, a rare move that instantly put the civilians on notice. The atmosphere dropped 10 degrees. I get it perfectly, Luke said, his voice now dangerously calm. My orders were to extract Mara. I took you on as collateral. Your parents, your home, your sentimental attachments. They are secondary to the objective. If they were preppers, they had a plan. If they weren't, they're gone. This is the reality. We do not deviate for emotional impulses. Sam, surprisingly, found her voice. But we can't keep going like this. We're just cargo. If there's a chance, we have to take it. We knew the risk when we came here. Let us take the risk alone, Mara interjected, sensing the need to mediate before Luke resorted to force. Luke, their departure would mean fewer resources consumed. They are not arguing for a detour for the whole group. If Mike knows the territory and they take minimal supplies, it could be a net gain for us tactically. Luke stared at Mara, his eyes a cold challenge. He was annoyed that she was trying to negotiate the terms of his command, but he was also forced to acknowledge her cold, pragmatic logic. 6 mouths versus 4. You are making a tactical error, Luke addressed Mike and Sam, ignoring Mara. Leaving the protective perimeter of this vehicle is suicide. You will be noise, you will be scent, and you will be slow. But, you are right, you are collateral, and I will not risk my unit's safety for your sentiment. He reached into his pack, pulled out 2 bottles of water, 2 MREs, and a standard-issue folding knife. He threw them onto the back seat. 2 minutes, Luke said, his voice flat with finality. Take the gear and get out. You are no longer under my protection or my command. If you make a sound that compromises my unit's position, we will leave immediately. Mike hesitated, relief battling with fear on his face. He grabbed the supplies, his hands shaking. Sam clung to him, casting one last, terrified look at Leah and Jonah, then at Mara. Thank you, Mike whispered, his voice humbled. Don't thank me, Luke replied, his face hard. Thank Mara for arguing the point. Now move. The clock is running. Mike and Sam slipped out of the side door, disappearing instantly into the shadows of the deserted town. The silence they left behind was vast, a tangible hole in the group. As Luke climbed back into the driver's seat, strapping in, his eyes met Mara's in the rearview mirror. Sentiment is a weakness, Whitmore. You need to temper your civilian instincts with your father's pragmatism. Don't do that again, noted Lieutenant. Mara responded, but she looked down at the empty space where Mike and Sam had been, her victory tasting like ash. She knew the reality. They were likely dead before dawn. The weight of silence. Over the next 2 days, the drive took on a new, darker atmosphere. The group was down to 4. Mara, Lila, her best friend and roommate, Jonah and Leah. The absence of Mike and Sam was a constant, heavy reminder of the odds stacked against them and the brutality of Luke's command. The reduction in numbers, however, meant the survivors had to confront the unavoidable truth about their loved ones. They were crossing a continent, moving further and further from the last known location of their families, a tacit acknowledgement that the chance of rescue or survival for anyone left behind was zero. Lila, who had shared a small apartment and countless late-night study sessions with Mara, broke first. In a quiet moment during a refueling stop in a remote stretch of farmland in Iowa, she curled into Mara's side, shaking uncontrollably. Your dad, do you think? He made it to the cabin already? He sent Luke, so he has to be safe, right? Lila's voice was small, choked with tears. Mara held her best friend tight, looking out at the endless, desolate fields. Dad's plan was always to get us here first, Lil. He's with the other preppers. He's safe. That's why he sent Luke. It was the script they were supposed to follow, but even as she said the words, they felt hollow. Mara's grief over her mother, who had died a decade earlier, felt suddenly distant and pure compared to this fresh, festering wound of uncertainty regarding her father. Jonah and Leah, sitting opposite them, shared a long, despairing look. Jonah's parents lived 3 states away. Leah's were in California. The sheer impossible distance and the silence on the satellite phone was the final proof. My mother was supposed to be evacuated by the National Guard. She works for the CDC, Leah whispered, her voice barely audible. She told me she had a secure channel. It's been days. If she was safe, she would have found a way to let me know. Leah began to weep, but it was a quiet, defeated sorrow. Jonah stared down at his hands. My dad, he's retired Air Force. He was supposed to get my mom to their rural retreat. I haven't heard anything since the report stopped. He had everything mapped, but if Shrouds can't get a clear signal to Marcus Whitmore, then my dad wouldn't be able to either. He looked at Mara, his eyes glazed with pain. We have to accept it, Mara. They are gone. Everyone we knew in the city. The families who didn't believe your dad. They're ghosts. Mara felt the words like a physical blow. Jonah was right. Her entire motivation had been predicated on the idea of reunion. Now, the goal had shifted. It wasn't reunion. It was refuge. Her father's existence was now the only thin margin of hope in the world. She met Jonah's eyes, and instead of offering false hope, she offered a cold, hard truth, the only thing she had left. Then, we become harder targets. We don't talk about them. We don't look back. We focus on getting to that mountain. They prepared us for this, and we won't let their training be for nothing. The small group nodded, an unspoken pact sealed in the grim darkness of the Humvee. The grief was still there, but it was now compartmentalized, locked away to be dealt with, only if they survived the next 72 hours. The price of command. Late that night, somewhere in Nebraska, Luke drove, his hands steady on the wheel, the tactical map glowing faintly on the console. Mara sat in the passenger seat, taking the observation shift. The others were asleep, stacked against the back cushions in exhausted heaps. The vast emptiness of the plains was unnerving. Miles of silent fields, the darkness punctuated only by the Humvee's powerful beams. "You handled that situation with Mike poorly, Lieutenant," Mara said quietly, breaking a 3-hour silence. She spoke without accusation, simply stating a fact. "You should have negotiated the supplies, not thrown them at him. You created unnecessary antagonism." Luke didn't turn his head, his profile illuminated by the light from the dash. "I eliminated the risk of infection and minimized the consumption of my resources. Sentiment is a luxury I cannot afford. If I am worried about hurt feelings, we die." "I understand the lack of sentiment," Mara pressed, "but the breakdown of trust is more dangerous than the consumption of a few MREs. You are my only link, Luke. I need to understand your motivations beyond the mission brief." Luke remained silent for a long moment, the only sound the low whir of the filtration system. "You're right," he finally admitted, his voice low and gravelly, the first time she had ever heard him concede a point. "You need to know the why. My name is Luke Shrouds. I'm 32. I'm not military brass. I'm a private contractor. I run a small, dedicated unit of specialists. I took this job because of Marcus Whitmore." He glanced at her, a flicker of something close to respect in his dark eyes. "Your father was my instructor at the Special Operations Training Center when I first went into the Army 10 years ago. He taught me everything I know about deep cover extraction, tactical logistics, and perimeter integrity. He was the only honest man in the whole damn building. He saw talent and discipline, not rank. He saved my career once. When he called with this contingency, I owed him." "So the whole 'I only follow orders' act is just a cover," Mara realized. "This is personal. This is professional obligation," Luke corrected, but the distinction was thin. "It's about loyalty to the man who built my foundation. That's why I'm taking this Hail Mary trip to Montana. Not for you, Whitmore, but for him." The air shifted. The barrier of rank and formality momentarily lowered. "And your family? Do they know where you are?" Mara asked gently. Luke's gaze sharpened, focused far ahead on the empty road. He hesitated, his knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. "I don't have a family," he said, the words heavy and clipped. "Not anymore. I had someone. A girlfriend. Sarah. She was a triage nurse at NYU Langone. When the initial casualties started coming in, before anyone knew what was happening, she was one of the first responders. We thought it was a new strain of rabies, a viral hemorrhagic fever. She was exposed trying to stabilize a patient who went critical while she was treating him." He paused, staring into the dark. "She died fast. Very fast. Before the news was even fully broadcast. She was among the first 1,000 casualties in Manhattan. That's why I moved my own timeline up. I saw it coming. I saw the absolute breakdown of competence from the top down. I know exactly what this virus does, and I know exactly how quickly it takes everything. I don't have sentiment, Whitmore, because all my sentiment is dead. All I have is the mission." Mara stared at the side of his strong, stoic profile, suddenly seeing the 32-year-old man beneath the lieutenant's tactical gear. A man burned by initial, terrifying loss. A man who had been driven to professional extremes by the death of the one person he loved. Her earlier fleeting attraction to his competence now deepened into a grudging, painful respect for his sacrifice. "I'm sorry, Luke," Mara said, using his first name for the first time. "Don't be," he answered, the use of his first name passing without comment. "It's just the cost of being alive in the city. Now, focus on the road. We are crossing into the Badlands soon. That terrain is predictable, but the roads are narrow. If we run into anything, we won't have room to maneuver." The conversation ended, the silence returning, but this time it was different. It was an informed silence, laced with the mutual understanding of profound loss and shared objective. Luke Shrouds was no longer just the commander. He was a damaged, essential weapon, driven by a debt to her father and the ghost of his own dead love. They had 3 days of near-impossible travel ahead, and the cabin in Montana felt like a dream. But now Mara knew exactly who was driving, and why. The Humvee was not just a vehicle, it was a vessel of moving grief, speeding toward a mountain range that might or might not hold the key to their survival. Chapter 5. The Badlands Grinder. The sun rose over the Badlands of South Dakota, painting the alien landscape in brutal, stark relief. Miles of deeply eroded rock formations and desolate, dusty plateaus stretched toward the horizon. The terrain was beautiful, but treacherous. An endless expanse of hidden gullies and narrow, winding roads that offered no room for error or maneuver. The Humvee, which had felt invincible on the interstate, now seemed cumbersome and exposed. They were deep into their 3rd day of travel. The air inside the cabin was thin, dry, and permeated with the stale metallic tang of fear and unwashed bodies. Mara was in the passenger seat, taking an observation shift, her eyes aching from scanning the monotonous, high-contrast landscape. Luke was driving, his movements economical, his focus relentless. "Fixer, elevation check," Luke ordered over the comms. "We're entering the Needle Pass section. Rook, anticipate bottlenecks. If the road narrows too quickly, we're exposed." "Elevation steady, Lieutenant," Fixer reported from the tactical seat behind them. "Road ahead looks clean for the next 2 clicks. But the canyons are deep here. If anything is hiding below, we won't see it until we're on top of it." Mara shifted, rubbing the back of her neck. "The heat is also a factor. If the infected retain any thermoregulatory system, the canyons might draw them in for shelter during the day. We need to move through this section fast." Luke nodded once, a brief acknowledgement of her reasoning. "Rook, push the speed. We breached the Badlands before noon." As if summoned by their cautious words, the calm silence shattered. The warning was not visual, but acoustic. A chilling, collective shriek echoed up the canyon walls, amplified and distorted by the rock formations, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. It was a sound of raw, predatory hunger, far louder and more cohesive than the usual moaning they had heard in the city. "Contact! Multiple! Closing fast!" Mina yelled from the observation turret. 10 o'clock, running the canyon floor. "Looks like a concentration point. Maybe 40-50 targets." Luke instantly slammed on the brakes, the heavy vehicle skidding slightly on the dusty asphalt. "Reverse! Rook, get us back to that wide turnout half a click back." But it was too late. From a blind bend just ahead, the road was suddenly filled. They weren't the shambling, slow-moving dead of Manhattan. These were predators. They were dressed in the tattered remains of hiker and park ranger gear, their bodies lean and sun-baked, their movements powered by a savage, unnatural adrenaline. Their skin was tightly stretched over bone, pale and cracked, giving them the look of animate mummies, but their speed was terrifying. They moved with a jerky, full-out sprint, covering the distance in seconds. The initial wave hit the front of the Humvee like a storm surge, a grotesque ballet of flailing limbs and gnashing teeth. Mara watched in horror as one infected male, its chest cavity horrifically distended, slammed into the ballistic windshield, its jaw snapping uselessly against the thick glass. The impact was so violent that a spray of dark, viscous fluid erupted from its head, coating the glass in a slimy, opaque film. "Visibility 0, Rook yelled, struggling to control the wheel as the vehicle began to rock under the onslaught. "They're climbing the chassis," Sarge roared. "They're trying to find the seams." Luke grabbed the shotgun, racked beside his seat. Mina, full spread. "Rook, drive through them. No finesse. Fixer, keep the civilians quiet. Mara, secondary defense plan. We are not safe in this box." The sheer volume of biomass pressing against the vehicle was overwhelming. The weight of the infected, combined with their frantic scratching and battering, made the Humvee feel like a tin can under attack by a swarm of rabid wasps. Luke saw a crucial weak point, the rear cabin door, the hinges stressed by the earlier violent entry. If they chewed through the seals, they were all dead. "Mara, we need to breach the roof and thin the herd," Luke commanded, his voice sharp but focused. "Get the thermal breach kit and 2 smoke canisters. We need a clear shot at the chassis climbers and a distraction for the main road." Mara didn't question the decision, which was insane given the risks. She scrambled into the back, pushing past the whimpering Jonah and Leah. Lila, white-faced but silent, handed Mara the thermal cutter and the smoke grenades from the underseat storage. Luke turned to her as she came back, the roaring of the engine and the thunk-thunk-thunk of bodies hitting metal, making communication nearly impossible. "We breach on my count. You cover my rear with the shotgun. Your target is the chassis, specifically the legs. Do not aim for the head, they're too fast. Got it?" Luke yelled, his face inches from hers. The pure, adrenaline-fueled intensity in his dark eyes was breathtaking. He was fully in his element, a predator among prey. Mara felt the fear, but it was drowned out by the surge of purpose. Understood. Low targets only. Watch your six, Lieutenant. Luke gave a grim smile, the first real, non-professional smile she had ever seen. A flash of pure, primal excitement that was deeply, unexpectedly attractive. He swung the reinforced door open, briefly exposing them to the deafening chaos, and climbed onto the hood. He used a shaped charge to blow a hole in the roof of the Humvee's cab, a controlled crump that briefly deafened everyone inside. Smoke billowed from the roof, and Luke, moving with impossible speed, swung himself up and through the small opening. Mara followed immediately. She used the handle to haul herself onto the roof, the hot metal slick with rain and gore. The outside world was a whirlwind of motion and noise. They were surrounded by a writhing mass of infected, their rotten teeth clicking, their guttural shouts like static. Above her, Mina was already engaging the far canyon walls with precise, low-impact rounds, keeping the main horde at a distance. Luke was already moving, his rifle spitting fire, targeted shots at the infected, scrambling onto the hood and the roof of the vehicle. Mara knelt, her body pressed low against the roof, leveling the heavy shotgun. Her hands were steady. She focused on the infected, trying to claw their way up the wheel wells, their skin peeling back from the friction. Boom! The first shot was aimed low, catching an infected female in the hip. The creature's legs instantly gave way, spraying a mist of bone shards and putrid tissue. It screamed, an inhuman sound of pain and frustration, but it was down, its movement neutralized. Mara tracked the next target, an infected male scaling the rear door. Boom! She blew out its knee, and it dropped, dragging its paralyzed body into the wheel well. They were working in perfect, terrible concert. Luke would clear the top half, taking out the aggressive climbers, while Mara ensured no one compromised the structure below. Suddenly, a massive, muscular infected, a former weightlifter, judging by the bulk, lunged from the side of the cab, attempting to grab Luke's rifle. Luke threw the rifle aside, drawing his combat knife, and engaged in a brutal, close-quarters tangle. The infected managed to drag its foul, diseased teeth across Luke's reinforced jacket sleeve, the sound a horrible, grinding scrape. Luke plunged the knife deep into the creature's chest cavity, then kicked it off the vehicle. But another infected, its face hideously swollen, took the distraction as an opportunity, launching itself from the cab straight at Mara. Mara didn't have time to raise the shotgun. She dropped it, grabbing the pry bar she had hidden in her belt, and thrust it upward. The reinforced metal tip caught the infected squarely under the jaw, puncturing the thin membrane of its neck. Mara shoved hard. The pry bar penetrated, emerging with a horrible squelch from the back of the creature's skull. The infected shuddered once, a final spasm of aggression, and went completely limp, its lifeless body draped over Mara's shoulder, obscuring her vision. The stench of its breath, sweet, rotten, and chemical, was overwhelming. She pushed the dead weight off, her hands shaking from the sudden, intimate contact with the viral host. Luke was instantly at her side, his knife drawn, checking her for wounds, his eyes wide with a flash of pure, raw concern that cracked his professional facade. "You're clean?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "Clean," Mara gasped, pointing to the infected impaled on her pry bar. Used the pry bar. Headshot. Luke's eyes dropped to the gory scene, then back to her face, a wave of complex emotion, relief, respect, and something hotter, passing over his features. "Good," he muttered, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Goddamn good, Whitmore." The moment was broken by Sarge announcing they were running low on ammunition for the larger deterrent rounds. "Now!" Luke roared. He tossed one smoke canister toward the main horde in the canyon, and another onto the road behind them. "Rook, drive!" Full power. The Humvee surged forward, the thick, acrid smoke from the canisters briefly confusing and dispersing the nearest infected. As they pulled away, the last thing Mara saw was the sight of a score of infected tearing into their own fallen comrades, driven by an indiscriminate, insane hunger. The aftermath and the fire, they didn't stop until they were 10 miles clear of the canyon, finally pulling off onto a high, open plateau miles from any major road. The sun was high, baking the red dirt around them. The immediate relief was immense, but the damage was visible. The Humvee was a mess, dented, scraped, and smeared with dried organic matter. Luke's soldiers were exhausted, their faces grim but victorious. Luke helped Mara climb back down into the cabin, his hands steady on her waist. He immediately stripped off his outer jacket, revealing a thick, ballistic undershirt that was torn where the infected had clawed at him. The flesh beneath was bruised but intact. "Mina, triage the unit. Fixer, check the seals on the rear cabin," Luke commanded, his authority reasserted now that the immediate threat was gone. Mara sat down, her legs trembling, and looked down at the pry bar in her hand. Still tipped with gore and dark, stringy tissue, she felt a sickening wave of revulsion, quickly followed by the profound alien sensation of survival euphoria. She had killed, and she had done it cleanly, to protect the others. Luke sat next to her, breathing hard, his intense focus never leaving her face. He reached out and gently took the pry bar from her grasp, placing it carefully on the floor. "You froze that moment we were face to face," Mara observed, her voice barely a whisper. "When the one was over me." "You hesitated." Luke leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, staring at the floor. He finally lifted his gaze, and for the first time, the mask was entirely gone. He wasn't the lieutenant, he was just Luke, a man whose composure had been shredded by proximity to death. "When you were under that thing, with that filth draped over you for a second, I didn't see the mission," he admitted, his voice rough. "I saw Sarah. I saw what they do to a person. I couldn't lose control. I couldn't have another ghost in the vehicle." He reached out, his gloved thumb brushing a small smear of black grease from her cheek. The touch was quick, accidental, but sent a shockwave through Mara. It was the first human, non-tactical contact they had shared. Mara looked back at him, seeing the dark pain in his eyes. He wasn't just attracted to her, he was fighting the gravitational pull of their shared loss, projecting his grief and need for salvation onto her image. But beneath the projection, their shared capability was the spark. They had faced an extreme, life-ending threat, and emerged as a cohesive unit. "I didn't need protection, Luke," Mara said softly, her eyes holding his. "I needed backup, I needed a partner to clear the field. And you were there. We worked perfectly. That's why we're alive." Luke inhaled sharply, the air catching in his throat. The tension between them was a palpable, dangerous thing, built not on romance, but on the undeniable, thrilling reality of mutual survival under impossible odds. He shifted, his professional guard slamming back into place, but the look in his eyes, intense, hungry, and deeply shaken, remained. "The cabin is 48 hours away, Whitmore," Luke said, his voice regaining its command tone, though it was still deeper than usual. "We maintain vigilance. We do not stop until we are in the mountains. We need to secure the perimeter and check the vehicle." "Understood, Lieutenant," Mara responded, the professional formality restoring the distance, though the heat of their shared moment lingered. As Luke turned to inspect the vehicle's damage with Rook, Mara looked at the remaining civilians. Leah and Jonah looked numb, but Lila, her best friend, looked at Mara with a strange mixture of awe and fear. Mara had changed. The girl who went to classes in New York was gone. In the heat of the Badlands, under a rain of gore and bone, she had become the hardened, capable operative her father had always trained her to be. And the man who had facilitated that transformation, the man who now carried the ghost of his dead love and the heat of attraction in his professional gaze, was her only remaining anchor in this nightmare. The Humvee was damaged, their resources were severely strained, and the journey ahead was still treacherous. But they were moving, and they were, terrifyingly, closer than they had ever been. Chapter 6. The Summit of Grief. The razor's edge of the ascent, the transition from the flat, arid plains to the sheer granite foothills of the Montana mountains was brutal. The air, which had been dry and hot in the Badlands, now sliced into their lungs, thin, freezing, and smelling of pine and ancient rock. This was the domain Marcus Whitmore had chosen for survival, a land that enforced its own quarantine with altitude and unforgiving wilderness. The Humvee, their steadfast sanctuary, began to struggle. The specialized engine strained against the steep, unpaved logging trails that snaked up the western slope of the Absaroka Beartooth Range. Rook had taken the wheel, his face grim as he wrestled the heavy vehicle over jagged, snow-dusted boulders. Snow began to fall, not a gentle dusting but hard, stinging pellets that obscured vision and iced the already perilous track. The soldiers were running on fumes, their exhaustion a tangible, heavy presence in the cab. Luke had not slept for more than 2 hours at a stretch since leaving New York, and the weariness was etched deeply into the lines around his eyes, his skin pale and taut. The civilian passengers were a silent, suffering mass. Leah was fighting altitude sickness, breathing in shallow, painful gasps. Jonah and Lila were huddled together, their eyes closed, their bodies vibrating with cold and motion sickness. Mara was the only one still upright, her alertness fueled by a desperate, anxious energy. She glanced at Luke. He was no longer the focused professional. He was a man in the final throes of a forced march. Yet, even in his exhaustion, his discipline held. "We're pushing too hard, Lieutenant," Mara murmured, keeping her voice low so the others wouldn't hear. "The engine is redlining, and Rook is going to burn out. We need a 4-hour rest cycle, 2-man perimeter." Luke sighed, a sound of profound fatigue. "I know the limits, Whitmore, But every hour we spend on this trail is an hour closer to being spotted by drone surveillance, or whatever remains of the government. The high ground is protection. We stop when the wheels fall off, not before. He was pushing them past their physical breaking point, trusting his unit's training and Mara's own inherited resilience to get them through. She understood his logic. Safety lay in verticality, but the sheer arrogance of his decision to continue without rest grated on her. An hour later, they hit a crisis point. Rounding a narrow bend carved into the mountainside, the Humvee's rear wheel snagged on an unseen boulder, sending a violent, sickening jolt through the cabin. The vehicle shuddered to a stop, its front end listing precariously toward the thousands of feet drop into the valley below. Engine stalled. Chassis seized, Rook reported, his voice tight with controlled alarm. Luke was out of the Humvee before the emergency brake had fully engaged. Mina, cover the downward slope. Sarge, secure the upward trail. Mara, help Fixer with the winch. We pull it off that rock now. Mara leaped out into the biting cold. The air was so frigid it felt like inhaling shards of glass. She ignored the shivering that racked her body and focused on the task. Fixer was already scrambling to deploy the heavy-duty winch cable, cursing softly under his breath. Mara, drawing on her father's extensive lessons in wilderness mechanics, took the lead. Fixer, get the primary cable secured to the tow hitch. I'll take the secondary line for stability. We need to anchor to that ponderosa pine, 30 yards up. She moved with an urgency that mirrored Luke's. She grabbed the secondary cable and sprinted up the icy incline, her boots slipping on the frozen scree. She could feel Luke watching her, not with affection, but with the intense scrutiny of a commander observing a critical asset. She reached the massive pine, wrapped the cable and secured the clasp, her fingers instantly numb from the cold metal. When she scrambled back to the vehicle, Luke was waiting. He looked past her, ensuring the lines were taut. That was a 20-second sprint on ice. Impressive, Whitmore, Luke said, his voice flat. That's what 10 years of wilderness drills with Marcus Whitmore gets you, Lieutenant, she retorted, pulling off her frozen gloves and rubbing her raw hands together. Their eyes met, and despite the life-threatening tactical failure they were managing, the air snapped with electricity. They were two poles drawn together by shared capability and mutual respect, fighting against the forces of nature and chaos. The moment was fleeting, instantly replaced by the tension of the winch, but it was a charged acknowledgement of their bond. The winch groaned, battling the friction of the rock and the weight of the armored vehicle. Slowly, agonizingly, the Humvee slid free of the snag, settling back onto the trail with a heavy, jarring thump. They had lost 40 minutes, but they were still alive. The Sentinel cabin. They reached the crest of the mountain just as the last shards of daylight faded, leaving a vast, cold expanse of twilight. The air was now bitterly cold, dropping well below freezing. Luke ordered a final, tactical stop a quarter-mile from the coordinates. We proceed on foot. Rook, stay with the civilians. Maintain absolute radio silence. No fire, no lights, Luke commanded. He turned to Mara. Whitmore, you know the security measures best. You're with me. Sarge, Mina, flank us. 50 yards on either side. Mara grabbed her father's signature thermal imaging binoculars and followed Luke out of the vehicle. The terrain was deep forest now, the snow crunching loudly under their boots. The cabin is built into the rock face, protected by a dense cedar grove, Mara whispered, speaking into her throat mic. There should be a runoff sensor pad about 50 feet out, connected to a buried perimeter alarm. It's dormant unless armed from the inside. They moved slowly, Luke leading with his rifle ready, Mara providing the vital information. The anticipation was agonizing. This was the promised land, the sanctuary Marcus had built for 2 decades. They found the grove. And then, they saw it. The cabin was a masterpiece of rugged camouflage. Built from thick, dark logs and seamlessly integrated with the granite cliffside, it looked less like a house and more like a natural feature of the mountain. It was utterly dark, silent, and covered in a fresh layer of undisturbed snow. There were no tracks, no sign of forced entry, no smoke from the chimney. It was dormant. Luke and Mara conducted a slow, meticulous sweep of the perimeter. Everything was precisely as Marcus would have left it. The reinforced heavy steel door, the camouflaged intake vents, the hardened storm shutter secured over the small ballistic windows. The cabin was a fortress, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Mara's heart swelled, with a relief so intense it bordered on pain. Her father had made it. He had prepared the sanctuary and was waiting, probably monitoring the deep band radio inside. It's clean, Lieutenant, Mara reported, her voice thick with emotion. He made it. He's here. Luke's face, illuminated by the beam of his headlamp, remained rigid, his jaw set. He didn't share her relief. He walked to the main door, examining the complex, coded keypad with a practiced eye. The biometric scanner is disabled, but the manual code is active, Luke noted. He turned to Mara. Your father would not have left this unarmed unless he was forced to evacuate, or he was secure inside. Mara stepped forward, ignoring the chill. She typed in the obscure personalized code her father had taught her years ago, a sequence related to the date of her mother's death. The thick steel lock clunked open with a mechanical sound that echoed loudly in the silent grove. Luke placed a breaching charge on the door just below the handle, a necessary precaution, but Mara grabbed his arm. No, he's not going to risk the integrity of the walls. It's safe. I can feel it, Mara insisted. Luke hesitated, looking down at her hand on his arm, then at the secure lock. He slowly pulled the charge off. Sarge Mina, cover the doors. Mara, you enter first. He'll recognize you, not the threat. Mara nodded, took a deep breath and shoved the heavy steel door inward. The air inside was stale, cold and utterly still. The main room was a single, large space dominated by a massive stone fireplace and a wall of organized storage shelves. Everything was meticulously arranged, preserved in the precise, paranoid order of a seasoned prepper. Cans labeled, water jugs stacked, rifles stored in their wall racks. But the cabin was empty. There were signs of Marcus's final preparations, completed recently. A thick layer of dust had been wiped clean from the main table, and a log was laid in the fireplace, ready for a match. On the heavy oak table, the satellite phone Mara had asked about was placed, but it was unplugged and dead. Mara walked over to the desk, her footsteps echoing. The dread that had been a dull ache for 3 days suddenly intensified, clawing at her throat. Next to the desk lay a small, personalized leather kit, her father's first aid bag. It was open. Inside, a roll of sterile gauze was halfway unspooled, and a nearly empty syringe of high-dose morphine lay discarded. But it was the small, handwritten note secured under a heavy granite rock that sealed her fate. It wasn't a note to Mara. It was a note to Luke. Mara picked it up. Her father's familiar, strong script blurred before her eyes, but the words were horribly clear. Luke. I didn't beat the clock. It was a stupid mistake. A contact wound on the final supply run, checking the perimeter. Time's up. You have Mara. Complete the mission. Ensure she sees the note. Tell her everything. Tell her I love her. I didn't want the last thing she saw to be this. You know what to do with the body. Don't tell her until she's safe inside. Mara let the note slip from her fingers, the sudden, paralyzing shock rendering her incapable of speech. The note confirmed everything, the failure, the sacrifice, and the horrible deception. Her father was dead. He had been dead before Luke even pulled up to her apartment door. She spun around, facing Luke, who stood framed in the doorway, his face pale, his stance rigid. He had known this moment was coming. He had known for 3 days. The truth of the promise. He's not here. Mara choked out, her voice raw, fractured. He's not here. And you knew it. You knew it when I called you in New York. You knew it when I asked you to call him on the highway. You knew he wasn't answering because he was dead. Luke didn't flinch, but the iron control in his posture finally began to crack. He stepped fully into the room, kicking the door shut. Sarge and Mina moved to the internal perimeter of the cabin, leaving Luke and Mara alone in the center of the silent room. Mara, I apologize for the deception. I was obligated to protect the mission parameters, Luke said, his voice low, measured, the tone of a man delivering a cold, unavoidable verdict. Obligated? Mara screamed, the sound echoing off the stone walls. He's my father. You looked me in the eye when I was terrified, and you lied. You said it was the network. I was following his direct orders, Luke insisted, his voice hardening again, reverting to command structure to hold back his own emotion. He called me 4 hours before I reached the city. He was doing a final sweep, ensuring the mountain supply was completely sealed. He encountered a runner on the lower trail, a clean hit, a single bite to the forearm. He contained it, but he knew the viral load. He knew the time he had left. Luke walked over to the desk, pointing to the empty morphine syringe. He wrote that note, injected the full dose to ensure he remained coherent for the communication, and then contacted me. He gave me the cabin code, the extraction route, and the final order: get Mara to the cabin. Complete the mission. Do not, under any circumstances, reveal the truth until she is secured inside the structure. Why? Why didn't he just wait? Why didn't he stay here? Mara whispered, the rage draining out of her, replaced by a cold, devastating comprehension. Luke looked down at the floor, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of his personal grief, the profound respect and sorrow for the man who had been his mentor. He couldn't, Luke admitted, his voice barely a breath. The final stage of the virus is aggression. He knew he would turn. He built this cabin for you, Mara, and he would never risk compromising it. He would never risk turning into one of those things and waiting here to greet you. He spent his final hour ensuring every supply was sealed, that the fire was ready, and that the cabin was safe. And then, he took the satellite phone, left the property, and went as far into the wilderness as he could, to die and never be found. That was his final, tactical move. He died so you could live here safely. Mara staggered backward, hitting the rough surface of the stone fireplace. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the floor, the full weight of the truth crushing her. Her father, the man who had been her rock, her entire world since her mother's death, had died alone in the dark wilderness, by his own choosing, to ensure her survival. He hadn't just prepared her for the apocalypse, he had been the first casualty of her safety. Tears, which had been locked away for days, finally erupted, but they were silent, burning, wrenching sobs that racked her frame. She buried her face in her arms, the smell of gunpowder and dry metal from her jacket, a stark reminder of the horror outside. Luke knelt down beside her, his movements stiff and hesitant. This was outside the mission parameters. This was human. He didn't try to touch her or offer platitudes. He simply waited, allowing her the moment of absolute, devastating grief. He was a man who had faced his own loss and understood that there were no easy words. After several agonizing minutes, Mara slowly lifted her head. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes, red-rimmed and fierce, were those of her father. "Where is he?" she demanded, the question low, brutal and simple. "Gone," Luke answered quietly. "Into the mountains. He chose his final ground. We won't find the body." It's what he wanted. Mara took a deep, shuddering breath, locking down the emotion just as Marcus had taught her. She looked at Luke, the man who had knowingly carried this lie for 72 hours, the man who was now the living embodiment of her father's final sacrifice. Her feelings for him, the initial attraction, the professional respect, the recent spark of intimacy, were all now hopelessly tangled with anger, betrayal, and a sudden, terrifying reliance. "You're a good soldier, Luke Shrouds," Mara said, her voice heavy with both scorn and the truth. "You completed the mission." "Yes," Luke replied, his own voice cracking slightly under the weight of her judgment. "I completed the mission." He stood up, regaining his military posture, the commander again. He turned to the soldiers, his voice returning to its normal, firm tone. "Sarge, Mina, Fixer, establish full perimeter security. Rook, bring the remaining civilians inside. We are secured. This cabin is now the primary safe zone." He looked back at Mara, the woman now sitting on the floor in her sanctuary, surrounded by the ghosts of her father's preparation. "Your father built this fortress to last 20 years, Mara," Luke stated, his gaze steady. "We are safe now. But my mission is done. The question is, what is yours?" The journey was over. The sanctuary was found. But the war, Mara realized, had only just begun. She had lost her protector, but she had inherited a legacy, a fortress, and a reluctant, complicated soldier bound by a deathbed promise.